Minister casually said, and I quote, $500 billion in the last 5 years alone of Canadian investment has left to the U.S. And he said probably $1 trillion in the next 5 years if we get the agreement that we expect to get. Wow. In other words, he made a massive $1 trillion concession before the deal was even signed and without getting anything in return. $1 trillion of exit investment means closing mines and factories in Canada and opening them in the U.S. Why did the Prime Minister sell out our workers on his visit to Washington?
The air inside Parliament was thick with tension. Every MP seemed to know that what had just happened in Washington could redefine Canada's economic future. The Prime Minister's return from the White House wasn't met with applause or celebration, but with shock. Because in front of international cameras, during what was meant to be a diplomatic triumph, the Prime Minister had admitted something no Canadian leader had dared to say aloud before. That in just 5 years, $500 billion of Canadian investment, factories, funds, and futures had already flowed south to the United States. And worse, another $1 trillion might be next. The House erupted. Opposition benches slammed their desks. One MP shouted across the aisle, his voice echoing over the Speaker's calls for order. "You didn't negotiate, you surrendered." They accused the Prime Minister of handing over Canada's wealth before even signing a deal, of admitting defeat before the fight had even begun. Outside the chamber, Canadians were left wondering, how did this happen? How did the country that once built railways through mountains and pipelines across continents end up bleeding capital, jobs, and opportunity into its southern neighbor? The opposition didn't hold back. They painted a picture of a Canada hollowed out, mines closing in Quebec, sawmills in British Columbia shutting down, auto plants in Ontario stripped of workers as their owners chased cheaper energy, lower taxes, and bigger subsidies across the border. For many Canadians watching, the debate wasn't about politics. It was about fear, the fear of losing everything their communities had built for generations. One MP stood and said, "We don't need speeches about pride. We need action to stop the exodus of Canadian money and Canadian jobs." But the government had its defense ready. Ministers leaned into the microphones, calm but firm. They argued that this was not a story of failure but of strategy.
Before moving forward, hit subscribe button, because this story is only getting started.
That the Prime Minister's visit wasn't an admission of weakness, but an act of diplomacy, keeping Canada in the conversation as the world economy shifts. They reminded the House that Canada was building again, with Canadian steel, aluminum, and lumber. That new infrastructure projects would create jobs and modernize the country's backbone. That the government wasn't selling out, it was buying time. But that explanation didn't silence the critics. Because for many, numbers speak louder than promises. And $500 billion leaving Canada was a number impossible to ignore. Behind those statistics were people, miners, truck drivers, engineers, and families who'd watched the heart of their towns crumble. In Quebec's mining belt, layoffs had already begun. In British Columbia's forest towns, mills were closing one by one. And in Ontario, auto workers were being told their plants would pause operations indefinitely, corporate speak for "we're moving south." The opposition framed it as betrayal. The government called it transition. But to the average Canadian, it just felt like loss. And yet, amid the fury, a deeper truth lingered beneath the debate, a truth few dared to say aloud. Maybe Canada wasn't losing because of one Prime Minister or one deal. Maybe it was losing because the world had changed, and the country hadn't caught up. Foreign investors were chasing speed, faster permits, lower energy costs, fewer regulations. And south of the border, America was offering all three. Billions in new subsidies for clean energy, manufacturing, and technology had turned U.S. states into magnets for global capital. Meanwhile, Canada, with its higher taxes, red tape, and slower approval systems, was watching the flow of money drift away like water through open fingers. Still, the government's tone was defiant. The Prime Minister stood his ground, insisting that his priority was Canadian workers, Canadian projects, and Canadian sovereignty. He pointed to infrastructure investments across the country, highways, ports, energy grids, built, he said, to make Canada more independent. He promised that new trade agreements would open fresh markets while protecting Canadian industries. That the era of dependency was over. That Canada would stand tall, not as a junior partner to Washington, but as a sovereign nation with its own vision. But the opposition laughed. They accused him of hiding behind patriotic words while quietly allowing the country's wealth to slip away. You speak of sovereignty, one MP shot back, but what's sovereignty worth when your capital, your jobs, and your industries are owned abroad? It was a gut punch of a question, one that echoed beyond Parliament, all the way to factory floors and kitchen tables across the nation. Because behind all the noise of politics, what Canadians really wanted was simple. Security. Stability. Hope. And right now, many felt they were losing all three. The fallout from that fiery debate didn't end when Parliament adjourned. It spilled into the streets, into headlines, into every home where families were asking the same question: what happens if the money really leaves? Because that number, $1 trillion, wasn't just a projection anymore. It was a countdown. Economists warned that if the pending trade deal went through under current terms, Canada could watch its largest exodus of capital in modern history. Not a trickle, a flood. A silent evacuation of investment that could hollow out industries from coast to coast. And the opposition seized that fear like fuel. They took to the airwaves, declaring that the Prime Minister had sold out Canadian workers before the deal was even signed. They called it economic surrender, policy by panic, and even the biggest wealth transfer in Canadian history.
We do not need Donald Trump's permission to open mines and roads and infrastructure in Canada. That's exactly what we're going to be doing, is building Canada with Canadian labor, Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, and Canadian lumber. If he's referring to the Maple 8, the pension funds that Canadians are so proud of and invest in, who invest all over the world and take their profits back to Canada to pay Canadian pensions, well, I say bring that on too, Mr. Speaker.
Every night, clips from Parliament went viral, angry MPs shouting across the floor, the Prime Minister defending his words, and the Speaker struggling to hold control. Across social media, the debate was raging in real time. Some sided with the government, arguing that global competition was unavoidable, and that Canada had to adapt. Others demanded resignations, investigations, and an end to what they called Washington's grip on Ottawa. The country felt divided, not by ideology but by fear. Because behind the numbers were lives, pensioners whose retirement funds were tied to foreign markets, young workers losing manufacturing jobs, small towns watching their lifelines dry up. And somewhere between all the outrage and the politics, the truth became blurry. Was Canada actually losing money to the United States, or were its corporations simply chasing opportunity where conditions were better? Was the Prime Minister complicit, or just brutally honest about a reality no one wanted to admit? Inside the Prime Minister's office, aides scrambled to control the narrative. Press releases were drafted, carefully worded to replace outflow with global investment diversification. Behind closed doors, ministers whispered about stabilizing the dollar, protecting pension funds, and fast-tracking infrastructure spending to prove that Canada still had economic muscle. But outside those walls, confidence was fading. Foreign investors began to hesitate. Business leaders quietly told reporters that Canada had become too slow, too bureaucratic, too uncertain. And every new headline about the trillion-dollar projection sent markets trembling. The opposition smelled blood. They launched a campaign titled "Bring the Money Home," pledging to rewrite trade laws and impose stricter conditions on foreign takeovers. Their message was simple and sharp. If Canada keeps bleeding investment, the next generation won't have an economy left to defend. Yet while critics were demanding protectionism, global forces were pushing the other way. Automation, AI, and clean energy revolutions were reshaping industries faster than governments could legislate. And in this new economy, capital flowed to wherever it could grow the fastest, borders be damned. That's when the debate shifted from politics to philosophy. What did economic sovereignty even mean in a world where money moved at the speed of light? The Prime Minister, facing backlash, delivered an unscripted address from a factory floor in Hamilton, surrounded by steelworkers, sparks flying behind him. He spoke not as a politician, but as a leader under siege. I know Canadians are worried. But this country was not built by fear. It was built by courage, by people who looked at the impossible and built anyway. We are investing in ourselves, in our workers, and in our future. And yes, we're competing with the United States, but we're doing it our way, the Canadian way. The crowd applauded. But outside the plant, protesters were already gathering, carrying signs that read "Jobs first, deals later," and "Stop the trillion-dollar sellout." The speech was meant to calm the storm. Instead, it poured gasoline on it. Because for every promise of investment, there were factories still shuttered and workers still out of jobs. News broke days later that another major Canadian company had announced plans to relocate its headquarters to Texas, citing favorable business conditions. That one headline sent shockwaves through financial circles. The opposition returned to Parliament with fresh ammunition. While you were shaking hands in Washington, one MP thundered, "Our factories were packing their bags." The Prime Minister fired back. He accused the opposition of playing politics with the nation's future, of scaring investors away with alarmist rhetoric. But even within his own party, whispers were growing louder. Was this trade strategy really worth the risk?
This government has already admitted that we have a problem with Canadian pension money leaving Canada to create jobs in other countries. They even created a Brookfield-run program to bring it back. But today, the Prime Minister promised the President that Canadian government policies would drive $1 trillion out of our economy into the American economy over the next 5 years. That is twice as bad as has happened in the last half-decade. This means lost jobs and lower wages for Canadians who already can't pay their bills. Again, why did the Prime Minister sell out Canadian workers in his visit to Washington?
And then came the leak. An internal finance report, obtained by the press, revealed that senior officials had privately warned months earlier that Canada's investment climate was deteriorating. Their conclusion was blunt. Without decisive policy changes, the country could face a structural outflow of capital exceeding $1 trillion by 2030. The story exploded. For the first time, Canadians realized this wasn't speculation, it was expectation. The Prime Minister was cornered. Defend the deal and risk being seen as complicit in the country's economic decline. Abandon it and risk collapsing the fragile relationship with the United States that kept trade flowing. Either way, it was a lose-lose scenario. In political terms, it was survival mode. In economic terms, it was an identity crisis. Because deep down, this debate wasn't just about money. It was about what kind of country Canada wanted to be, a safe haven for its own industries, or a player in the brutal, borderless arena of global competition. The final act was yet to come. But as the House prepared for another emergency session, one truth was already clear. Canada's wealth was leaving faster than its leaders could decide how to stop it. And the question hanging over the entire nation was no longer how much had gone, but how much more could Canada afford to lose? The chamber was silent. For the first time in months, even the opposition benches had nothing left to shout. The leaked report was out. The numbers were real. And the illusion of stability had shattered. The Prime Minister entered the House, expression carved from stone. Behind him, the weight of a nation's disbelief. In front of him, a Parliament ready to explode. He stood, adjusted his notes, and spoke softly, almost too softly. Yes, our investments have moved south. Yes, capital is leaving. But Canada is not collapsing, we are transforming. The world is changing faster than ever, and we will not be left behind. The words were steady. But even his allies could see the strain. Because transformation was a nice word, yet on the ground, transformation looked a lot like loss. The opposition leader rose next. You talk about transformation, he said, but Canadians see closure. You talk about courage, but Canadians see surrender. This isn't evolution, it's evacuation. Thunderous applause followed. The line was brutal, unforgettable, and by evening, it was everywhere. Across the country, people watched the confrontation like a national reckoning. Families in shuttered towns. Workers with empty paychecks. Everyone wondering who was telling the truth, and whether Canada could still stand on its own feet. Days later, the government unveiled a last-ditch plan. A national retention strategy, promising tax reforms, faster permits, and incentives for industries that stayed in Canada. The Prime Minister called it the biggest comeback plan in modern history. The opposition called it too late for the factories already gone. Markets stabilized slightly. But the damage wasn't just economic anymore, it was psychological. For the first time in a generation, Canadians were questioning whether the system built to protect them still worked at all.
You know what Canadians feel when they see the Prime Minister and ministers in the Oval Office defending Canada? Mr. Speaker, they feel pride. They feel pride that this Prime Minister is standing up for our country, standing up for our workers, standing up for our steel industry, and these crazy hair-eyed schemes that the Leader of the Opposition comes up with just to get in the news cycle are quite frankly a little embarrassing.
And yet, in that uncertainty, something shifted. Communities began rallying around local industries. Small manufacturers reopened under new ownership. Unions and entrepreneurs, once rivals, found common ground in rebuilding. Because maybe sovereignty wasn't something you signed in a trade deal. Maybe it was something you fought for, every day, in the places where real work happens. In the final scene of that turbulent season, the Prime Minister faced reporters on Parliament Hill. Snow fell softly. Cameras clicked. He looked exhausted but resolute. Canada's wealth is not measured by how much money leaves, he said, but by how much faith stays. And for the first time in a long while, even his critics paused. Because no matter the numbers, no matter the losses, one thing remained true. The story of Canada had never been written in surrender. It had always been written in resilience.
Canada debates.